John Keats is one of my favourite poets of all time, second only to William Shakespeare. Yes, Keats may not have the ingenuity and inventiveness of, say, Milton or Chaucer, but he speaks to me, and if I can get more people reading his works, then I will be happy. And to mark the occasion of kicking off a new lecture series on the poetry of John Keats over at the book club, I would like to give you some recommendations of where to start with Keats. I'll give you some recommendations if you're a complete beginner, a complete newcomer, an intermediate, and a more advanced reader. But first, I would advise that you know something of John Keats's life. His life was tragically short. He was picked off, like his mother before him, and like his brother Tom, who he nursed. He was picked off by the family disease tuberculosis. He lost his father at a young age. His life was full of tragedy. He had originally trained to be a doctor, but somewhere early along the way he realised that poetry was his true love. So he was unschooled in poetry, but I find that the best poets often are. The best poets aren't those who come from aristocracy and are widely schooled in Latin and Greek. They're poets like the Cockney school of poetry, which Keats was very much part of. He died early. He didn't see his 26th birthday. Thank goodness he matured aesthetically so early on, and it does make me sad to think about all the poetry that we do not have. If only he had lived another 10 or 20 years, what beautiful poetry would we have to relish and cherish. I think Keats would have gone on to create his own mythology, one every bit as compelling as that of Paradise Lost. So, in addition to knowing a little bit about his life, you probably want to know a little bit about his aesthetic influence and who he was influenced by. He was thoroughly influenced by Shakespeare. Many will point to allusions to Spenser, of course. Keats was a huge fan of the chivalric, courtly romance conventions, medieval Arthurian legends, stories and tales of fairies, for example. And I like that too. That's probably part of the reason why his poetry, and it's beautifully sounding, so sweeps me up regularly. He was one of the first poets I came to. He would go on to influence many before him, the same way that Shakespeare influenced him. We see Shakespeare riven through his expressions, his deliberately deployed archaic expressions. Keats would influence Walter Pater, who said that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. His studies in the history of the Renaissance is a stellar read and a manifesto on art for art's sake. And whilst speaking of art for art's sake, Keats most certainly influenced the charming Oscar Wilde. He influenced John Ruskin, and John Ruskin influenced Proust. You only need to look at Keats's letters, which are works of art and aesthetic splendour in and of themselves, to see some parallels with him and Proust. Proust, who said that our social personalities were a creation of the thoughts of other people and that we are corporeal envelopes. Keats, in a letter to Benjamin Bailey, said that if I see a sparrow before my window, I partake in its existence as it picks about the gravel. It was in his letters that Keats also mentioned this idea of negative capability. We go in depth into what this means in the Hardcore Literature Book Club, but negative capability is all about being able to sit with uncertainty and doubt and the mysteries of life without an irritable clamouring after fact and reason. Who does this best? Shakespeare does this best. We don't judge the characters of his paganistic universes. We don't judge the characters of King Lear, and we don't clamour after fact in Hamlet and Othello. We are just awestruck by his aesthetic power. So you want to know something of this idea of negative capability when reading Keats to fully appreciate him. You also want to know about this aesthetic theory of ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is, simply put, when you try to replicate one art form within another. Near the beginning of Melville's masterpiece, the long prose poem Moby Dick, we are treated to a resplendent picture in the Spouter Inn, a picture of a whale, and we see it thoroughly. When Keats writes Ode on a Grecian Urn, we see the urn. I love this style of literature. It has a long tradition throughout English literature and throughout many different languages. I personally get a lot out of ekphrasis. If you find this compelling and interesting, then you'll love Keats. You also want to be cognizant of his truth is beauty, beauty truth quote. Many have attacked him for this, including Robert Bridges and T.S. Eliot, but Keats never said this. He put these words into the mouth of a Grecian urn. Truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. This is not Keats's philosophy on aesthetics, although it is rather close to it. And the fact that it has been the catalyst for so much vehement intellectual and poetic disagreement really attests to just how persuasive and sincere this sentiment really is. Another piece of advice when coming to the poetry of John Keats is I would really implore you to read him aloud, because he really writes for the auricular, the same as Shakespeare. He writes to be mouthed and felt on your tongue, and he writes for one to deliver his poetry to a captive audience. There are many great volumes of his work. He has been endlessly anthologized. He's probably the most anthologized poet in the English language. I recommend this cheap Wordsworth edition paperback, which you can probably pick up for $1 or less. This was the first volume that showed me the power of Keats. I love it. It's got all his poems in there. If you want something a bit fancier, Every Man does a great pocket poets for Keats in a hardback burgundy that you can carry around with you. All his great poems are in there, so you can rest assured if you get that one too. So, read aloud to somebody, and if you're a relative newcomer to Keats or somewhat of a beginner for poetry, then I recommend you start with his great Odes. His most prolific time of writing was 1819. He wouldn't go on to live much longer, but luckily he had that year. His great odes include Ode to Psyche, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale. Those two are my particular favourites. Ode to a Nightingale shows John Keats's mastery of the auricular, whereas Ode on a Grecian Urn shows him to be a master of the visual. This is the Apollonian Dionysian duality of aesthetics. Dionysus is Bacchus, the god of drunken revelry, often characterised in the spirit of music, and Apollo is the god of form, best characterised in art by sculpture. Ode on a Grecian Urn is a great place to start. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. But also start with La Belle Dame sans Merci. He wrote this in his productive ode period too. Oh, what can ail thee? Night at arms, alone and palely loitering. The sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing. This is a beautiful, beautiful ballad. If you're an intermediate and you've already read some Keats and would like to explore more, I highly recommend you dive into his sonnets. On looking into Chapman's Homer, on sitting down to read King Lear again, these are both stellar poems. I also recommend the relatively long but very rewarding Eve of St. Agnes too. St. Agnes's Eve, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. And if that's not enough, I recommend his poem on the Elgin Marbles. I also recommend Bright Star, the poem scrawled in the margins of Keats's copy of Shakespeare. If you're more advanced and you've read a lot of Keats, I would urge you to try to dip into his unfinished mythology, Hyperion. That is a posthumous work, and I would encourage you to explore some of his other posthumous works too. And you may also wish to explore his juvenilia, like Endymion, and explore his letters as well. So there we have it, the poetry of John Keats. Do let me know which poem of his you are going to start with, or if you already have a love for Keats half as strong as mine, then please do let me know which of his poems is your favourite. And if you've enjoyed this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe, because it tells me to keep making more content. And speaking of more content, if you want bookish lectures on the great works, the great poets, then check out patreon.com/hardcore literature. Have a lovely day and happy Keatsing.